Okay, I think we're good to go, right? So, hi everyone, and welcome to our March webinar. Today we will welcome Dr. Adrián Oyaneder Rodríguez, who will be presenting his research on the trapping of ungulates like vicuñas in the South Central Andes. Before we get started, while we meet in a virtual platform, we would like to acknowledge the importance of the land which we call home. From coast to coast, we respectfully acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people who call this land home. Hola a todos y todas. Bienvenidos al webinar de marzo, donde contaremos con la ponencia del Dr. Adrián Oyaneder Rodríguez, quien nos presentará su investigación sobre la captura de ungulados como vicuñas en los Andes Centro-Sur. Antes de comenzar, mientras se van uniendo los participantes en la reunión virtual, nos gustaría reconocer la importancia de la tierra que cada uno consideramos y llamamos hogar. De costa a costa, reconocemos con humildad y agradecimiento el territorio ancestral y eterno perteneciente al pueblo Inuit, Métis y Primeras Naciones, cuyo hogar es esta tierra. Y ahora le paso la palabra a mi compañera Patricia, quien presentará a nuestro invitado.
Thank you, Adrián. Thank you, Adrián. Sorry. Adrián is a database manager for the AHRC Found project, Biocultural Heritage Information in a Virtual Environment at the University of Exeter. Dr. Adrián is a Chilean archaeologist focusing on South American archaeology, particularly Andean studies. He has conducted extensive fieldwork in North Chile. His work integrates geomatics and digital technologies to study and digitalize archaeological heritage, with a particular interest in collaborative research with indigenous and local communities. Currently, he leads an University of Exeter and a European Space Agency Found project on the chacu hunting traps in northern Chile. Dr. Oyaneder obtained his bachelor's honors in social anthropology with a major in archaeology at University of Tarapacá, Chile. He completed his PhD at University of Exeter, and his doctoral research was a multi-temporal and multi-scale study using archaeological, historical, ethnographic, and geographic data to examine the traces of subaltern indigenous group in the Andean highlands of northmost Chile. Thank you, Adrián, for being here with us.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you everyone for organizing this and for the invite as well. I'm going to start sharing my screen then. Right. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. Right, so welcome everyone. Thanks again for the invite to present my research project here. And just to kickstart really this talk and presentation, this is an interesting panel of rock art coming from a rock shelter in the Arica highlands, so that is in northernmost Chile. As you can see, there's a lot of representations really of camelids in general, as well as human beings, and some perhaps more abstract figures as well, that may or may not represent hunting traps, as well as other perhaps trapping techniques like polas, for example. So just to kickstart then, let's see if this is working. Right, so my presentation really is about beyond the real hunts, in the sense that traditionally speaking, in the Andes, and in particularly the South Central Andes, we have common knowledge and understanding, especially coming from historical accounts and a series of really isolated findings of traps about a specific festivity, if you like, that was mostly conducted by the Inka for capturing, in particular, vicuña, so that was the main target, And then as a secondary target, as it says in the first rectangle there with text, guanaco as well, Andean deer, and even rheas perhaps, and foxes, but those are secondary. And so as I was saying, the main target was the vicuña. Here on the image on the right, we have a representation of how these royal hunts may have happened, right, with people impersonating the Inka. And you can see the animals already been shown. This activity was conducted and mediated and even controlled by the Inca, so as the rulers, and they were the only ones that supposedly were authorized to lead this capturing and deciding when that happens. There's a couple of first accounts that talk about this type of royal hunting. That is Cieza de León in 1553 and Pedro Pizarro in 1571. And a bit later, Garcilaso de la Vega in 1609. And as a common element of these accounts is the fact that, firstly, it's a collective type of trapping animals, so it requires a group of people. Secondly, it's described always that it's highly effective. So by having, I don't know, they describe in terms of numbers, it's difficult to assess in reality how real the numbers of people and animals trapped are and are presented in those, but in general, 200 people, 4,000 captures roughly. So, you know, they have like a big gap in terms of numbers. I'm not sure, but they clearly reflect on the fact that, you know, for a few people, you can capture quite a lot of vicuña, to the point where they actually could be a bit selective and they will only hunt what they needed. Also, in colonial times, this festivity is coined as chacu. And in general terms, as I said before, the main evidence that we have and information comes from early colonial accounts, really. As opposed in pre-Hispanic times, we don't have much information about them so far. And in terms of the South Central Andes, to think about really the geographic distribution of where we in South America, here I have a map on the right that shows the whole region based on you can see all of the western lands by the Pacific Ocean, but as you're climbing to the east, then you go up to the Sierra or Precordillera, and then to the Altiplano as well. And these valleys share a couple of elements in common in terms of ecology. So most of them have a monsoon water rainfall, really. So basically during the summer season, rainfall occurs, and most of these drainages get activated, right, by these rains. But a couple of them, like Camarones in particular, in Utah, for example, this is in Chile, are perennial, so they're continuous over time. So going back then to the vicuña, one may start asking what is the importance of the vicuña, and why was the main target really for the Inca in this case? And it's mostly due to the quality of its fiber. So I'm going a bit ahead of myself. I'm going to show in a second what I mean by that. But just to also give an understanding of why also was this protection in place is because, as in comparison to the guanaco, the vicuña is a niche environment animal and ungulates. So it only lives in a specific altitudinal range, approximately 3,500 meters above the sea level, up to approximately 4,200 meters above the sea level. And you have two species of the vicuña. And so here we have the whole distribution. And as opposed to the guanaco, really, that is widespread in terms of where it can live, including obviously the coast. And then I didn't add here the Andean deer in general, but roughly shares the same habitat. I say roughly, that's important, with the vicuña. So zooming into what we know about the vicuña nowadays, most of them live in Peru. And that is clear by the distribution, at least of the species that it's found in the north. And then Chile actually is the last country in terms of the distribution and the amount of this animal, right? And ecology in general show us that these animals not only are niche, but also they are quite prone to change in accordance to rainfall, mostly rainfall really. So the availability of what they can eat. And going also into why it's also important and why the Inka was protecting these animals is because apparently the chacu was so effective and the fiber is so coveted, and it was so coveted that the populations started to decrease across the years, and that is also well represented in colonial times. I'm not going to get into much detail on that. We can, if you want to know more about that, you can ask me. But just looking at recent numbers, in 1982, the vicuña was considered a vulnerable animal, and it's because precisely of that. It's because of poaching, and it's because of people targeting the hides of the vicuña. And because there's been a well-established trading between the Americas and Europe for that to exploit the vicuña fiber. So during the 80s, all of the countries that have vicuña signed a treaty by which they decided to give a level of protection to this animal, and that has been, of course, really successful in terms of now the vicuña is considered the at least consent animal protection level, really. So that's really good. And how did that happen? It's not only about signing a paper, really, or signing a contract, but it has to do with the fact that communities that live nearby the habitat of the vicuña were asked to help in rounding up the vicuña using a chacu, which is what you can see up here in the upper right corner. So really long arms traps that work like a funnel, that's a chacu as well, by where a lot of people start right in the highlands or in the top of the mountains, and little by little they're driving together all of these animals until they get to the final corral, where they are nowadays they measure things like their weight, they count them, and they also check on their health. So how this became something sustainable as well for the communities, and it wasn't a thing that was just for the sake of the protection of the vicuña, was actually exploiting the fiber of the vicuña. And nowadays you have many festivals around the Andes that actually are for this purpose, right? For the protection and the exploitation of the vicuña fiber, but in a sustainable way. Now, recently in Bloomberg, it's been raised a concern really in terms of how sustainable is this approach. Even though it looks good on paper, it seems to be the case that it's not that sustainable for the communities anyway, which is a shame. As you can see here, what I wrote, the most important takeaway from this is the fact that this company is approximately having 3,100% of profits from this vicuña, right? And in their website, this is a capture that I took a couple of weeks ago, so it's this year. You can see what are the prices that the end consumer actually pays for this, right? So there's always like this high interest in the vicuña apparently, and people are happy to pay these prices. So what is all the hype about the vicuña fiber? So here we have some images that I took from Zoccola et al. 2023. And as you can see in all of these images, all of them are at the same zooming level. And the vicuña, that is G, shows that actually it's really thin. The thinnest and is the finest actually fiber for the production of textiles. So clearly that's the main hype about it, is the fact that it's really thin, therefore it's really workable, and it's for that reason as well soft. But in this case, yeah, we have, right, the kind of more modern or more recent exploitation of the vicuña, but certainly, as we see in the title of this presentation, the royal hands, there was a reason why the Inka also wanted to exploit this animal, and clearly it's for the fiber more than anything else, and it's to produce the finest garments and attire, really, that they could wear. And in accordance to a lot of historical accounts, this was mostly made with vicuña fiber, combinations of other fibers. I'm not a textile expert, but to me, what is clear is that element, right? That they were using the vicuña for those purposes. Now, thinking about the distribution of this animal in a modern sense, of course, because it's difficult to assess what was the distribution of these animals and what is the rates of the populations across the landscapes. But considering what we have nowadays, you may wonder if the north of Chile in particular it's got the least number of vicuña. What is the importance here for this presentation in particular to focus on the Camarones Valley that is in the northernmost region of Chile? So I'm going to read an extract from Fraisier from 1712, where he says, the vicuña, the wool, is extraordinarily fine and much valued, and sometimes these are hunted after such manner that deserves to be related. So many Indians get together to drive the vicuña into some narrow pass where they have made cords of wool across 3-4 feet from the ground with bits of wood and cloths hanging off them, right? And what he is describing here actually is what's happening in Arica, in the highlands of Arica. So that's 100 kilometers north to Camarones. And in terms of the cords and the wool and all of these parts, you can clearly see that those elements here in the Chaco de Vicuñas de Baltasar Martínez de Montañón, that even though it's an area a bit far away from it, it's clear that there's something going on there that have got similarities. And in terms of the more the latest exploitation in historical times, because to these days it's still exploited, but it's another logic, we have some evidence actually of trade from Chile, from a couple of Chilean ports, including Arica, by where the vicuña was exported all the way to Cadiz and even ended up in London coffee houses, right? And a couple of fashion, if you like, magazines of the 19th century show that people were wearing vicuña actually, and it was considered a really refined element. And also, on the left, we have here this map where we can see vicuña hunters, Chaco Alto, Chaco Bajo, that is referring certainly to places that have an importance in terms of the exploitation of the vicuña, in my opinion, which is fairly obvious. But interestingly enough, it's a bit south to the distribution of the vicuña, and actually is by the coast. So Bahía de Nuestra Señora, Puerto Vetas, Morro Aldán, Puerto Gaucho is by Paposo, which is actually at the coast. But here we also have the Cordillera de Domeico, which reaches roughly 3,000 meters above the sea level and a bit more. So perhaps there was a corridor there that was, allowing the vicuña to get into those places. I've been looking at satellite imagery from these locations, and I cannot see any Chaco. But maybe you can try your luck and let me know if you do. Right, and in northernmost Chile, as opposed to what's happening mostly in Peru, in Bolivia, and Argentina in terms of the protection of the vicuña, there's been a couple of attempts as well to, in a way, revive this type of capturing of the vicuña with the traps, but it hasn't been that successful, perhaps due to the distribution and the density of this animal in the region. But in general terms, people doesn't talk much about it if you ask them, especially in the highlands of Camarones, right? But what they do talk about is that they were using similar traps to the chacu to capture feral donkeys that perhaps were, no, not perhaps, actually, they are associated basically to the silver trade from Bolivia all the way to Chile and the coast to then ship the silver elsewhere in Spain. But, well, and in that case, the donkeys became feral, and people until recently exploited these animals actually to produce pate. Right. So going into the Aymara world, as opposed to perhaps the Quechua-speaking Inka world as well, we start to find that there's a lot of information about this type of trapping. And in particular, you can see here that there's a lot of words that refer to trapping vicuñas, hunting vicuñas, even rodeo of vicuñas and so on, ropes, elements that are in use, fences, and so on. So clearly there's a practice that, at least by 1612, when Bertonio was in the area, right, noticed. So, and here we have also an illustration made by Gerald Vigil Diaz, and that shows mostly and roughly, obviously in an illustrative kind of way, how the chacu works, right? Right. So, why then I'm talking so much about the vicuña and hunting, and in particular about traps in the Andes of northern Chile and in Camarones, is because between 2018 and approximately 2021, I covered the basin of this valley, this river valley. So what you can see in orange or red as an outline. And I covered these using remote sensing techniques. So that's my main field of interest and expertise, really. And what I found was that above 3,000 meters of the sea level, you find plenty of architectural evidence, as in a small scale architecture, so a couple of houses here and there, and roughly they cover pretty much all of this area from 3,000 above sea level all the way up to the very end of the basin to the east. I'm not showing everything here, really. What I'm showing is actually types of chacu. Sorry. We have to bear in mind as well that before my research in Camarones, there were a couple of references on the chacu in the Andes, but I will say no more than 10 sites discovered. In tandem with my research here in Camarones, a couple of authors also were investigating the area, apparently due to perhaps interest in exploiting freely available satellite imagery, as in Bing Maps or Google Earth and other sources of satellite imagery of high resolution. But certainly, we all agree, I think, that this is an area of unusual density for this type of human technology. Right. So we found so many, at least in Camarones, and then I could find more to the south, that actually it gave enough traction to start developing a typology. So what you can see on the upper right is how I define what a chacu is. I'm sorry, I'm just going to minimize this. You're not seeing this, but it's a bit annoying to see my face there. All right, so a chacu is composed by, number one, a coral, always, or an end structure. Number two, by arms or antennas. Number three, cells, so circular structures that are part of the of the arms of it, and number 4, barbs. But in general terms, the main one that you can find actually is this one, right? So this one that you can see over here. And my typology, even though it's a bit convoluted in terms of having from A1 to A4 and then B and C and so on, what I want to actually clarify here as well is that this is part of my PhD research that was published in 2022. However, at that time, we had, in terms of freely available imagery, roughly 50 centimeters per pixel, which means that I couldn't see much at the level of zooming that I require to actually identify well things. So for example, a big rock versus a small structure and so on. So I'm starting to think that this typology doesn't hold up very well, because actually we can see more, thankfully, due to the latest versions of satellite imagery that is available, as I say, mostly freely available, right? So to get into the chacu that is found in Camarones then, just gonna try to show the pointer. Right, laser pointer. Okay, so here we have the base, if you like, type of chacu that is basically like a bottleneck or a funnel that is located always on a slope, and the lowest part of the slope will have the coral, and from the coral climbing up the slope you will have the 2 arms, right? So that's the classic bottleneck. We also have a couple of chacu with multiple arms or antennas, like this one. But again, on the slope, the very lowest part of the slope has got the coral, and then the arms are climbing up. So we also have a bit of unusually long traps as well, with a barb over here, and also, you know, an arm that is covering all the way from the river to the other side of the river. And even like some structures in between. As human behavior is complex and variable, because we don't think in an industrial way in terms of repeating things on and on, we also have an outlier, and a couple of outlier cases really, by where you have only one arm and then a coral or a pen that is unusually positioned in terms of the topography, if you see what I mean, in terms of the slope and where the river is flowing. And one element that I will describe just in a second in more detail is that creeks and water flowing in general, waterways, are always associated to the chacu and the slopes, always. In few occasions, you don't see this. But for example, here you see how water that flows presumably during the summer rains, is affecting a chacu to the point that the coral is almost destroyed. And in this case, here we have a coral that is also in the middle of where the water flows, but we have a repair, because I think that here, for example, we have one arm, the original one that was cut by the water, but then you have a little repair over here. Right. And now in terms of the arms and the coral that I've been talking so much about, what is clear is that also we have a dominant or longer arm and a minor or shorter arm, right? On average, the longer or dominant arm is about 181 meters in length. Then we have the minor with 97, and with an average difference between them of about 83 meters. And the average area of the coral itself is 95 square meters, okay? So here we have a scatter plot as well over here that shows pretty well the distribution of these 3 factors and these 3 elements, just to kind of understand perhaps more as a distribution what is going on in the graph on the right. Now, throughout the years, I've been asked, are you sure these are hunting traps? And what you are finding actually is the chacu per se. So for that, and for obvious reasons, we went ground truthing in the area. We managed to cover approximately 6 chacu now, because bear in mind that they're like distributed in a really spread manner across the landscape. There's not in every instance a nearby road that you can access by a vehicle. This is the highlands. So what I'm trying to say, and kind of self-apologizing, is the fact that, you know, accessibility is not the easiest. So that's why so far we cover 6 of them. And what I want to show really here, it's the coral itself. So again, going back to that question, how do you know that this is not for herding animals, right? It's because we always have this drop. So there's a clear difference in level between where the arms join together to the coral and the coral itself, if that makes sense. So you cannot, no, that's not very clear. Going back to this one. So yeah, here is clearly the drop. Now, bear in mind as well that this perhaps has been accumulating more and more soil. So the original wall level is not fully exposed here. And also the wall over here has been collapsing, right? So if you want to really hurt your animals, you don't need to actually drop them into a pit. And now I know that is sometimes challenging to compare technology across continents. So by no means I want to be a diffusionist here, but we have similar solutions to hunt actually other animals that are equally elusive and fast as ungulates in, for example, Jordan with the desert kites. And the desert kites also actually show this drop, right? Ending in a sort of a pit as a coral. So that, as I've been told by colleagues like Dani Nadel in Israel, mentions that that's a key element to consider, that these are for hunting as opposed to perhaps other purposes. And so yeah, going back to sloping water, I've been thinking quite a lot lately in terms of why always, for not the benefit actually of archaeology, they decided to place these traps in the middle of a stream or a creek or a small water flow. And I think it's because of what you can achieve in terms of what this location provides. With this, I mean the fact that it creates a natural corridor, obviously. So where the water flows, coming from a height down to a lower space and with a slope, you can have that natural effect. So really what you have to do here is to make sure that you cover the necessary space to create this bottleneck effect when you're driving the animals to the trap. In the middle, you have a slope map. So the clearest the color, so the whitest, is the more slope you have in terms of degrees. So this white is 90 and black is 0. So you can see here that they're clearly using up elements of the natural topography that helps to create this bottleneck effect. And on the right, we have the orthomosaic. So how does it look like in true colors, really? And this is a photogrammetric derived data set. So we have these two derived from a digital elevation model, and this one is from the images per se. And again, water management question mark. So here we have a coral that has been fully destroyed due to the fact that it was placed in the middle of a water flow. But equally on this same chacu, you also have these elements that I was breaking my head to understand what it means, because you have them, you know, on the corners of the arms. So in the whole extent of the arms, you have these openings here. So my understanding is now that perhaps these were helping to drain water out from the walls just for the purpose of preserving walls. Because clearly this wall that I'm showing here, it's collapsed, so it was taller than this, and what we have here is the evidence of, you know, allowing the water to pass through, so it won't necessarily tumble completely the wall. Now that you know more about the chacu per se, I wanted to talk more about what is the other importance of the chacu, really. in terms of people in the Andes and what we know from them. So Choquela or Chuquila is a ceremony that happens in Corpus Christi, Achacachi in Bolivia, and in other parts of that side of the Titicaca Lake. And it's a siku dance that basically reenacts the capturing of the vicuña through the chacu. So you can see here these sticks and ropes, and there's even like a baby vicuña that is being desiccated, really for, representing that. So trapping the baby vicuña. Well, we have the chacu de vicuñas that you know more about now from what I described before. And then you have the soco. So the Chipaya people live in Bolivia, in the vicinity of the Coipasa salt flats, Salar de Coipasa. And in general, I will say for the Chipaya as well as the Aymara, the vicuña has got quite an importance in terms of their deities and perhaps elements of how can I say this? I just want to avoid a word, but yeah, basically they have an importance in terms of in religious terms, in general terms as well, right? So the soco itself, is the wind that is coming from the coastline in Pisagua and Iquique. So these are two places in the coast of Chile that goes all the way up to where they live. And it's a really, it's a wind that is wild. And in his process from the coastline in the Pacific all the way up to the Andes, they say that it's trapping vicuñas, that is making asado de vicuña, so roasting vicuña. And is constantly also in competition with the fox. And this is actually quite fascinating because this was described by Cereceda in her article in 2010. And this is a translation from that paper where she mentions that the routes highlight certain points. So the routes right of the Soco from the Pacific all the way up to El Salar de Coipasa, that the Sea of Iquique or Pisagua, La Tirana in the Pampa, Junco Apacheta. So basically they describe a series of places when you're going up that are factual, and you can actually find these place names in the area of precisely the chacu. So we have the Surire salt flat, and basically this is the area of the Camarones basin. And as you can see here, we have, for example, Caico Hill or Cerro Caico, and they describe Caicu. And what is that word? It's another term to refer to the chacu, actually, but with the difference that that's the version of the curacas of the festival, by where they also celebrated something similar to the royal hunts, but at a regional level. And around here, you actually find chacu, you find traps. And so they mention, as I was saying, Kaiku and Isluga, that is a really important place for the Aymara people. And you can actually find it here as well on the map. So to close, because I really want to give a space for questions as well. In general terms, there's evidence of a deep historical memory around the chacu as a capturing device in Camarones in the Arica highlands, right? In terms of historical references, I'm really intrigued by the Choquela hunters because they're also an ethnic group described as Choquela per se, and that they were unruly, they were cimarrones, maroons. And this maroon and cimarron description, it also overlaps with, for example, other groups called Uro in colonial times that are referring to these people that doesn't have police, no tienen policía, and that, to me, they reflect a type of people that was highly mobile, perhaps foragers. And so, yeah, that's something that perhaps could bring more light and shed more light into what is the reason of these traps being in this part of the Andes. So certainly also there's a lot of potential to know more about the chacu. We've been excavating 2 of them. We have radiocarbon dates and we're expecting to publish that information. But what I can already say about those excavations is that there's not a lot of material culture coming from the corals, because we've been mostly focusing on the corals. And it's because of things perhaps being washed out due to that relation to the water, runoff waters that I described. And also because of the type of trap that we have, the type of evidence, which basically is an activity that happens in a specific time of the year, maybe June to August, if we overlap it with what we know about the chacu in terms of a festival that is being celebrated now. And yeah, we don't have also evidence of pucaras or villages nearby of the chacu. So you can clearly have a distribution that shows that these things are separated as well. So yeah, no many settlements nearby, large settlements, of course. And also there's another important type of evidence that we have to look into, and it's the fact of the continuity in general of the chacu. So by remembering the first slide that I showed you of that rock art drawing, those are roughly from 6,000 BP before present. And if I am right to interpret them as chacu, then we have a continuity that, you know, starts in 6,000 BP and it carries on until our days. So clearly this is a practice that it's been sustained for a long, long time. But in any case, surely with all of the chacus that we have, at least 1 or 2 are going to show early evidence, as well as perhaps more later. Now, the important thing also will be to understand what is what. So of what we have more, right? If it's the earliest, if it's pre-Hispanic, or maybe it's colonial. And also, we understand that also from the textiles, it's difficult to identify vicuña. So we are currently working on identifying vicuña from the fibers, so from textiles that are from the Museo San Miguel de Azapa at the Universidad de Tarapacá in Arica. So we're doing DNA tests to start evaluating if it's a real possibility to have to identify, right, vicuña from DNA from the textiles, and then with that understand actually what was the real usage of this fiber, or if it only follows what we know from the historical accounts in terms of the Inka using the vicuña. And to close, just to acknowledge really a couple of projects and sources of funding that are coming from Chile that supported this research, as well as the European Space Agency, the Royal Geographical Society, the University of Exeter with a couple of internal funding grants that I got, the Digital Humanities Lab for the photogrammetry and all of the geospatial elements of my research, and all of these lovely people that I work with throughout the years. So thank you so much, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Adrián. Thank you for your talk. Has been really interesting.
Did anyone on Zoom have any questions? Julie, I don't know if anyone on Facebook has any questions.
I don't see any Facebook questions at the moment.
I had a question. I was curious about the slopes associated with the corals. And you mentioned there's not a lot of material culture because likely the sort of washing away of material. Do you think that there might be a function to avoid having water pooling to ensure things like mange and other diseases don't affect the animals that are kept in for periods of time within these corals? I was curious about the sort of epidemiological potential implications for why it's set up the way that it is. Also just in terms of kind of downhill flow. But is there any indication for the types of techniques people either are still using or there's archaeological evidence for it to be aware of avoiding having these sort of parasites and other diseases impacting animals?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, also just to clarify that nowadays, mange in general is a huge problem for the vicuña. So that's why also the chacu is celebrated, to make sure that, you know, as many vicuñas as possible are vaccinated against that and treated and so on. But still, I mean, it's a big threat regardless of that. And for pre-Hispanic or historical times, I'm not entirely sure. It's a really good question, but I don't know also when mange started, and if we can, you know, find any difference between what was brought really during the contact period versus what was, you know, preceding that. And in the corals in specific, I don't find any system of drainage as opposed to the arms. So that's something interesting. We do have windows that look at a couple of volcanoes and hills of clearly importance for them. But yeah, other than that, you find a lot of coral that are fully collapsed due to water kind of pulling, or just, you know, affecting everything really on its way down.
Thank you.
I have a question, and I have like a bunch of questions, but I'll start off with probably something that I guess you're still working on as you ground truth these structures. But I'm curious about the possible antiquity of some of the structures, and I know that you have like rock art that depicts the use of chacus, and that's really interesting to know that these structures are possibly in use from 6,000 years before present. But yeah, I was wondering if you have any additional information on possible material culture or sites that might be associated with these chacus. And then additionally, do you think that there was an increase in the construction of chacus under Inca imperial rule to be able to supply the Incas with vicuña fiber?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Julie. Actually, that reminds me that I forgot to mention that we did survey around the traps that we visited. So the first thing to say is that in the Precordillera floors, so that is basically the altitudinal range of the chacu distribution that overlaps the vicuña. With the vicuña, you always find in this area a lot of surface materials, no matter where you are. So, you know, you have that element of that density. So basically, where water doesn't flow too much, you're going to find, you know, pottery sherds, a bit of lithics here and there, projectile points, and so on. However, in the chacu and in the vicinity of them, I found a bit of a soup in a way of materials, in the sense that we have a lot of pottery, so a bit more density than what is compared to what is nearby. And chronologically speaking, just from relative chronology, I'll say from the late Archaic period all the way down to the late Intermediate. But if I wouldn't trust much those as proxies for chronology, just for the fact that you have this scattering all over. Even though we have some more density, I will only trust what is coming from excavations more than anything. And just because, you know, these things are on a slope usually, so there's a possibility of things migrating from higher places as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that response to my question. And then another thing that I was curious about is particular. So I mentioned to you before that I work in the Cusco region, and specifically in the Sacred Valley. And there's a lot of taruca or Andean deer in that region. And there's ethnohistoric accounts of deer being hunted in that specific area in association with Inca royal estates. And so I was wondering whether you have any information on whether deer would also be hunted using the same kinds of structures, or whether there might be other techniques that were used primarily for hunting deer.
Right. So the scattered information that I found on these traps from the sources that I cited, they do mention taruca in general as a secondary prey, as I was saying, but yeah, certainly was part of the mix in terms of what they could capture. And one thing that I did for my PhD, was the fact that I didn't have information on what is the distribution in terms of the hotspots in the landscape of where the vicuña was found, but I did find taruca. So I did do an overlap of these traps with these hotspots, and the coincidence level is actually quite astonishing. So they overlap really well. So that's something to further investigate as well. And in pre-Hispanic times in general, in this region, you do find in rock shelters, skeletal evidence of taruca as well. There's also a paper in Chungara, 1995. I can tell you later the name of the author, but they talk about the taruca in general terms, and they mention the gamitadera. That is a type of flute. I don't know if you know more about that, but that's kind of the only one that I can quickly remember from the area.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. I'm definitely gonna have to check out that article in Chungara. And I do have two questions from Facebook, so I'll go ahead and read those. First from Rainer Hosnig. He says, Adrián, ¿existen representaciones de trampas en arte rupestre de Chile?
Yes and no. So Hans Niemeyer, in his book about the rock art of the Sierra de Arica from the 70s, he's the one. I mean, that's the source of the first slide that I showed. And he says that these lines that you can see there can be either chacu as traps or maybe bolas, just because you also have a couple of animals, right, that are tied up from their neck. So that's not technically how the bola will work, but I don't know. That's what it's been described. And then more recently, Marcela Sepúlveda, Carol Duduñón, they've been also investigating this rock art, always associated to the naturalistic type, I'll say, that is called, yeah. And yeah, that's, from this 6,000 BP to a couple of millennia later. And yeah, they also kind of are in these debates, open debates, in terms of, we have these lines, we have them associated with camelids in general that seem to be wild, at least from that naturalistic point of view. So yeah, I would say it's an open debate. They also propose at some point that maybe the chacu is an Inka thing and only Inka. So I think, I don't know, it's open until we find some more like substantial evidence, at least from the chacu, in terms of having this overlap, chronological overlap.
Perfect. And then the other question I have is from Morgan Hall. She says, I have a question about the comparison with the corral structures seen in Jordan. Do they similarly have little material culture associated with them, or is it much more likely to find hunting technologies? She says.
That's a really good question as well. So thank you so much for all of these questions. So yeah, I'm not an expert on the desert kites. I've been having conversations with people that work these topics, but all I can say is that for a long period of time, they were really unlucky in terms of finding in the corrals specifically material culture in general, or any type of evidence really, until they found in this trap, I don't know, hundreds of gazelle bones. And I say hundreds because there were many, many, many. So that's a kind of an unusual thing. So they've been able to date them. So they do find organic material that it's, okay to date. But I think that because we haven't excavated too many of them, kind of, the question is still open to see what happens there. But yeah, now in terms of surface material, I'm not sure in Jordan what is the case. So I can share if someone sends me an email a couple of references to that.
Okay, awesome. I can ask another question, but I don't know if Patricia or Adrián have any other questions. I don't want to take over completely.
Go ahead, go ahead.
One question that I had was about the traditional knowledge that might still exist in local communities that live around these chacus. And specifically, I'm curious about the construction of the chacu and how long it might take or how many people might be involved in these construction activities?
Yeah. So they know about them because they're mostly herders, the people that you find associated to this landscape. And in particular, we've been talking a lot with people in Parcoaya, and they say, yeah, of course. I mean, my granddad or my dad, used to trap donkeys in these installations, but they don't call it chacu or kaiku or any of the names that I referred to. Actually, they call them trampas de burros, so donkey traps. So for them, it's just for the donkey, nothing to do with the vicuña. And perhaps it has to do with the fact that the vicuña was a protected species of, well, still is protected. So maybe that's something that has to do with like perhaps the short-term memory of the area. And in terms of the construction itself, knowing how these herders are so strong and skillful, I wouldn't say that it will take them too much time, really, especially working at a community level. Just considering of how they also deploy similar walls, because these are dry stone walls anyway, as you could see from the pictures. So, they do similar drives, sort of as in terms of walls to drive their sheep or whatever they have, llamas and so on, and it doesn't take them long.
Okay, that's awesome. Thank you so much. And then I think my last question for now is that I remember when I first learned about trapping vicuñas, and it was kind of framed as something that's very sustainable because it's something that the vicuñas are shorn and then they're let go and they can roam free again. But I remember hearing that in some cases the vicuña's loss of their wool can leave them vulnerable to the cold, and that this can sometimes result in the death of some vicuñas that are shorn. And I was wondering whether you have any knowledge on the degree to which this practice might be sustainable in terms of the ability for the vicuñas to sort of be able to protect themselves and warm themselves in the cold.
I will say I'm not entirely sure, so I don't want to get into trouble. But I know that usually vicuñas nowadays are shown in those periods when actually it's beneficial to the animal in rough terms. So June to August. I mean, it's cold, but yeah, there must be a reason why they're doing that. They are shown only once every 2 years. But I think that the major threat really from this exploitation, right, for commercial purposes, particularly guys like Europeana, is the fact that they've been trying to find ways that are not necessarily associated with the community by, purchasing big swathes of land in, for example, Pampa Galeras and around, and then trying to have wild animals as if they were theirs. So kind of like ranchers to some extent. And there's been clear indication from veterinarians and biologists that will end up in inbreeding. So therefore, accentuating the risk of passing disease from one generation to the next one. And, we know what it causes. So I think in terms of risks, that's one that I can clearly remember.
That makes sense. I can imagine that this kind of industrial scale demand for vicuña wool could cause so many different problems, and also possibly maybe lead to shearing the vicuñas more often than is normally recommended, or shearing them in the winter when they could be at risk of freezing or enduring extreme cold. So that makes total sense that the sort of more traditional way to do it is very sustainable, but especially with this increased demand for vicuña wool, that could change. So thank you.
Certainly.
Mhm.
Okay, well, thanks so much for joining us. Patricia, I'll let you close us out.
Yeah, thank you, Adrián, for the talk and the generosity for being here with us. And nothing more, just to say thank you to all the audience, and we will see in another activity next month. So we will announce in advance. Thank you, everything. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for the invitation.